Everywhere I look right now on the internet and in my friendships and my communities, I'm seeing so much unhealed trauma or so many questions about trauma. It's a huge topic online right now, and it's prompted me to want to share how I healed my trauma, the story. And before I dive in, I just want to say at the beginning of this video that my position is that we all have traumas to some degree or another. Some of us maybe bigger traumas than others, but it's really our personal relationship to the experiences we've gone through that determines whether it's traumatic or not, right? So I have a pretty broad view of what trauma could look like. Mine is pretty intense, my trauma story. If you don't know my trauma story already, I'm not going to tell it in this video per se. I might reference things as I talk about how I've healed it. We'll link to that video below for you to watch that video if you want. But I also really wanted to say before I dive in here that the reason I'm sharing this story is because I was searching myself for other people like me when I was wanting to heal, when I was trying to heal, when I was in a lot of pain, when I felt traumatized and trapped. And there really weren't very many stories out there. I had to go find some pretty extreme stories in maybe the stories of like Desmond Tutu, for example, or reading about even like, I don't know, like historical sagas like Joan of Arc felt comforting to me, or Native American history and the pain that they experienced on an individual and collective level when we first got to the United States. Somehow I felt comforted by those stories because I wasn't seeing in my modern world anybody that sounded like me, or where I could like listen to them and say, oh my God, that's like me. They're like me. And if they did it, so can I. And I'm seeing some trends right now online that, I'm not really judging anybody. I just see maybe like a missing lane. Like the trends that I'm seeing online we're mostly hearing from people way after they heal certain traumas, and a lot of the time they talk about their story in an interview and they're giving some concise sound bites or a bullet point list of things they did. And some people are getting vulnerable and sharing the actual like nitty-gritty of it, but it's rare in my experience. And so this isn't going to be a how to heal your trauma in 10 steps video. I don't think that exists or is really useful to anybody, because you watching right now, whoever you are, you have your own unique blueprint for how you got to this moment, what you're carrying with you, and what you need to heal. And then we also have, human traits that we share, right? And human qualities that we all share, and we can look to each other. I find stories to be more helpful to me than bullet point lists or someone talking as if they know what to tell you but haven't lived it. So a lot of preface there, but I want you to know my orientation to why I'm sharing this, and I really hope that it's useful to you if you are here looking to heal trauma. And I definitely believe I healed my trauma in a pretty unconventional way, so I'm going to talk about that as well. But my healing journey really began when I was 24, and I was living in South Carolina. I had grown up on the West Coast predominantly and then moved to South Carolina when I was 24. And I found myself in a really unhealthy, toxic relationship where there was a lot of jealousy and mistrust and then convincing of each other that we're actually good people and we love each other. And but it was like so toxic, lots of fighting, lots of crying, and that relationship really is what woke me up to there's something really, really, really wrong here that I could observe about myself, that I was like almost addicted to this relationship. Like it was such a strong compulsion in me to take him back every single time he profusely apologized, or in the interim of if there was a split or a fracture happening in the relationship, to daydream and fantasize about him changing his behavior and then we would like ride off into the sunset together, right? So raise your hand if you've ever been in that situation. So I knew that something was going on that felt compulsive, addictive, unhealthy about it. And I also had the self-awareness at that age to realize if I didn't figure out why I was deeply drawn to this dynamic, I would just repeat it again over and over. I can't really tell you where that self-awareness came from. It was just there. Maybe I was born with it. But this is what really sent me on my healing journey. And I've always been a writer. I've always loved writing. I was in honors English classes in high school, and I always thought I'd either be an artist or a writer. Writing has stuck with me. The art didn't so much. But I love to write, and so I was a journal keeper. Like I had already been keeping journals for quite a while. And that's probably in the mix as well, and I'm going to return to it in just a second, where that's kind of started. But it was very unconscious for me. Like the journal writing was almost compulsive as well, and it wasn't an intentional thing I was doing to heal before up to this point when I was 24. So I did a lot of journaling, through my late teens and then into my early 20s, but it was not conscious whatsoever. At 24, I consciously turned to journaling in an attempt to self-reflect and try to understand my own psyche and what was going on inside myself. And I also ended up in a therapy office for the first time in my life. But the journaling came first, and it was really the journaling that helped me orient towards myself in a new way. And some of you have probably heard this before. I've mentioned it numerous times, but it was in one journaling session where it was like a stream of consciousness, and it came out of my pen. I am utterly traumatized. And when I wrote those words and then visually looked at them in my journal, like I'm getting chills right now just thinking about it again. But my whole body relaxed. It was like this part of me that was like, finally, she said it. She's admitted the truth. Like, there it is. And everything I had been pretending not to be came into consciousness. And now I was in more alignment with the truth of who I was. And talk about sobering. I think the word utterly is really important there. I didn't just say, I am traumatized or I have trauma. I said, I am utterly traumatized. And I felt utterly traumatized at 24. I felt trapped inside my body and inside a mind I didn't understand or know how to help. I felt haunted. I felt, I was just like, living with so many sensations in my body that felt intolerable to me, from anxiety and probably fear, if I had to name it now. I don't know that I could have identified it back then. But a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncomfortability, a lot of digestive issues, a lot of self-loathing, and this has really, marked the start of my healing journey. And the first thing I did after writing that was to seek out a therapist. And this was in 2004. So this is pre-Google, I believe, or pre-YouTube. Anyway, I don't even know. I think 2006, wasn't that Google? Anyway, it wasn't highly accepted, talked about, embraced as still a pretty fringe thing, which is like crazy to me now. So I'm like, what? Even in 2004, like therapy wasn't a widely recognized usable resource, right? That was like lauded as a good thing to go seek out. And so I kind of just landed in the first therapist's office that I got in contact with. Like I didn't know the difference between one therapist and another, or different modalities. I didn't even know there were different modalities of therapy at 24, but I did somehow know of therapy. And it was a very interesting experience for me. I think it was positive, and it also was not positive. So I want to share this because I'm curious how many other people maybe have experienced something similar to me. I began sharing my story, and uh, the the therapist deeply empathized with me, I think, and that felt really good. It was the first time in my life that I felt like another human being was giving me the space to like dump, and I had a lot to dump verbally. I just had a lot to get off my chest, and that absolutely helped. And in the process of doing that, I think I saw her twice a month for 6 months or once a month. I'm not sure. It wasn't a lot. I couldn't afford very much. And somewhere through that process, like, halfway through maybe, I'm not sure, I started to feel like she was taking my side against my family in particular. And at the time, I lived with my parents, I believe. No, I didn't. Didn't live with them. I lived in the same very, very small town in South Carolina. But I did live by myself, but I worked with my dad. So I had a lot of family contact at this point. So I worked for or with my dad in his business. So there was a lot of communication happening between me and my parents. My brother lived in the same town, and my aunt lives there. So lots of family around. And I suddenly felt like, wow, here's somebody like taking my side, which felt great. But something about that didn't sit well with me because I ultimately wanted to heal it with my family. I didn't want to just be me against my family. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm the victim, you're the villain. That narrative has never fit with me. It's never sat well. I don't want anything to do with it, really. So that's why I actually stopped therapy at that point. I guess what it did for me was like open the can of worms. It opened Pandora's box, and I couldn't shut it again. I definitely couldn't put, whatever came out of that box back in. It was out now. And fortunately or unfortunately, it created a lot of chaos with me, inside of me, and with my family. So there were a lot of family conversations that started to happen because what happened for me at this time, at 24, 25, somewhere in there, is I started to feel my anger. And I was really angry. I was maybe even rageful. There was just a lot of anger in me about what had happened in my life when I was a teenager, and even before that. Numerous pieces, many of them, that I was angry about. And I couldn't contain it. And it was coming out of me in really messy ways. So I completely 100% own that. It was coming out in the present. Like I was trying to not talk about the past with my family because it generally never went well. Yet I was having to have contact with them, and I just, whether they were like, hey, how's it going, Alicia? And I was like, fine. Like, what do you want? It was just like, I couldn't contain this anger in me. And looking back now, I have hindsight about this part of my healing journey that I didn't have at the time. And I know partly what happened during this time period is I got some healing, and it was like taking 10 steps forward. And then I definitely encountered some re-traumatization for me of the exact circumstances that kind of created the trauma to begin with, in direct relationship with my family. And I stuffed that back down. I didn't feel like I had a good outlet for it or a good way to process it. Nobody I was going to was helping me in the way I wanted. And I had limited resources at the time in terms of money, and I had already done this 6 months of therapy. I didn't really, I guess at the time, think that I could do more, or I didn't know who I would even go to. So I went through a period after this of like kind of being more internal and pulling my energy back in and not trying to do as much externally. But I was doing something else at the same time that helped me tremendously. So two main things at the same time. So from 24 to about 26 and a half, something like that, I was in this relationship, this really turbulent, toxic relationship I mentioned. And I allowed myself to stay in it as long as I was doing the work to figure out why I was so addicted to it and compulsively drawn. And the most work that I did with that was journaling. So writing to me, I think, helped me heal more than anything else, honestly. If I had to point to one thing in all these years of what has helped me the most, it's journaling and writing. But I want to get more specific with you in case this is helpful to you. I definitely allowed myself to write stream of consciousness stuff, like whatever was top of mind, and I would just get that out. But I also wrote letters to people I never sent as journal entries. So I allowed myself to fully express all of my rage, my anger, my sadness, my confusion, my blame, even to the people, everyone, every player in my trauma dynamic or drama, that that was a part of it for me, and I think that was really useful in looking back on it, because what was happening for me at this time that I had no words for that I do now is I was validating my own experience. I was validating my own pain. I was validating my perspective. I was allowing myself to feel things that other people told me I shouldn't feel or wasn't healthy to feel. At this time, there was so much positive thinking exploding in the world. Like, it's still there today, but it was like rampant in this kind of like time period of my life. And there was a lot, I encountered a lot of kind of pushback when I would want to express my feelings of anger and rage or blame, or even, like what might be construed as blame, but is coming out as a question, like a demanding question. How could this have happened to me? Or how could you have let this happen? Or how, like, why didn't you do X or Y of certain people in my life? And, that might get construed as blaming, but I was searching for answers. I was searching for truth. And I do think that there is some measure of objective truth to be had in stories of trauma. And there's the subjective truth, and both are equally valid and equally important to honor, in my experience. So I probably journaled almost every day, maybe every day, I'm not sure. I have boxes, like probably 3 boxes full of these journals that I've lugged around ever since. I've kept them all. And what also happened at this time that ended up in my journaling experience was I found Tony Robbins. And I was actually gifted, ironically, by my brother, by a family member, an audio, like his Personal Power 2 program on CD. And it totally changed my life. Like, I owe Tony Robbins such a huge debt of gratitude and thanks for changing my life at 24. And I want to be specific about what I found there that helped me, because I'm not sure what he's doing is 100% conducive to healing trauma. It didn't help me completely. It just sent me on the path that ultimately helped me completely. But the main thing for me with Tony Robbins was the idea that I could take control of my life and didn't have to wait around for anyone else to do anything, say anything, be anything for me to feel free or to feel okay. That I could decide how to think, what to feel, and what to do with my life. Like, that was, I didn't need more than like a 1-sentence permission slip from him. When I first started listening to his audio course, back then. I mean, and I was off to the races. So I think that that was always in me, is like I wanted to be self-empowered, and it's in me to take radical responsibility. I'm also kind of a control freak, and that actually came out of my trauma as well, but it has actually served me. So if you are listening to this right now and you find yourself doing controlling things to feel, in control and less of a victim or, victimized by circumstances, then I highly encourage you to utilize that part of you and make sure you're actually using it in really healthy ways for you to heal. So, because I think for me, I wasn't maybe before that. So I probably listened to Personal Power 2, I don't even know, 30 times maybe more than that, every single day. So I lived way out in the boonies in South Carolina, in the middle of nowhere, 45 minutes from a gym that I would work out at. So I had an hour and a half 5 days a week, so because I worked out 5 days a week at this gym, where I would listen to Tony on the way there and listen to him on the way back, over and over and over for 2.5 years. I tried, to do everything he said. I definitely didn't do all of it. I was observing in myself, wow, I have followed through for certain things and not for others. So then I would listen to it again and try again. But the thing that I think like 2 or 3 things that he recommends in that program that changed my life forever. And I credit this time period of my life with giving me a foundation of 2 or 3 critical habits that have lasted since then and helped me heal through even harder aspects of my trauma when those things came up for healing. And those things were, it sounds simple, but he has that practice of every day writing in a journal, 3 things you're grateful for, 3 things you're, maybe excited about, and 3 things that are going to change your world or your business or move you forward. Something to that effect. I don't remember exactly. And I had the hardest time with it. I mean, sometimes I had to write, I am grateful for my heart beating on its own, because I couldn't come up with anything big that felt big or that felt, I don't know, like, and I did try my best to feel the gratitude, and it was really, really challenging, but I did it anyway, and I did it for a year. So for a whole year, every single day, I would write 3 things I was grateful for in the morning, 3 things I was excited about that day. And let me tell you, this time in my life was like not very exciting and not very, now I can look back and go, wow, I'm so grateful for, going through all of that. But hindsight is 2020, right? At the time, it was extremely difficult, extremely. And I so desperately wanted to believe Tony that this would change my life that I committed. And it changed my life. But something I extracted out of that for myself, I'm not sure where I got it, or if it's been so long since I've listened to Personal Power 2, I have no idea if he says this anywhere. But I started a practice of, I challenged myself to every single day, after I showered, I had a full-length mirror. So I would come out of the bathroom, look in the full-length mirror naked, and I would say one thing to myself out loud that I appreciated or loved about my body. And I don't think I realized how powerful that was going to be for me, because one of the reasons I wanted to do it at the time had to do with my external appearance, not anything internal. But I realized that there was like a misalignment there, and I hated my body. I mean, I loathed my body from the time I was, 13 to this time period, 24, 25. I mean, it was an everyday battle, and it was one of the first things I would think of in the morning. Like I hate, I hate you. I hate you for feeling so bloated. I hate you for being short and fat and Italian and, so muscular instead of tall and lean and skinny. And what I know now, oh, and I love my body so much. I'm so sorry I ever did that. But what I know now is that we project onto our bodies all of our traumas and our, like our feelings. And the body is what carries the burden. The body is, holding all the unfelt emotions. It's holding onto the trauma for us until we're ready to look at it. It is trying so desperately to mirror to us what we're unwilling to feel or to acknowledge or to look at or to confront. And I mean, we're never going to get anywhere. Like, I don't believe you can heal a body you hate, period. So for me at the time, it was like, well, this is the only body I'm going to have for the rest of my life. Might as well learn to love it. It was like really practical. And I was trying to give myself a practical exercise to find something to like about this body that I was living in, even though I still hated it every day. And so, I mean, it would be like, I like my collarbone, or I guess my eyes are okay. Like, I think I like my eyes. And I would be like looking in the mirror. And I don't know, it's so interesting to recall the story and look back on it because there's so much pain there. And it was so hard to do this, but doing it for a year changed my life. Like, I know that simple exercise of every morning coming out of the shower, looking at my body in the mirror, I think that's super important. It wasn't just like kind of glancing down and just naming something randomly, but really looking at myself. It created a new kind of relationship with myself where I started to become the observer of myself. I started to become the observer of my body itself, my physicality, but also what I thought about myself and why I thought about myself, what I did, and what I felt when I would look in the mirror. Like, what is it like? How many of us genuinely look at ourselves, whether it's internally or externally, and really, really try to see ourselves? Like, I think that's not what I was trying to do back then, but I think it happened out of that practice every day that I was doing that. So I did that for a year. And that, in combination with all the journaling and the Tony Robbins exercises, and really kind of ingraining into my I guess my mind, my brain, my body, that I could change my life, that I could change my story, that I could decide my destiny. It was a seed planted, and it was not an overnight thing. So I know, like a lot of people that I've talked to, I know when I have conversations with Stefan about this, I know from talking to some of you online, we want a result now. Like, it's so hard to keep going and doing these hard things when we're not getting a tangible payoff, right? Oh, and I gotta tell you, like, it will pay off so big in ways you can't even imagine if you commit. Like, I promise you. I don't know how it's gonna look for you exactly. I don't know what that payoff will be for you. It might be different than for me. But if you can find something to commit to like that, a simple practice every day of turning towards yourself instead of away from yourself, I believe it could change your life radically if you give yourself enough time and patience. So all of that was happening from 24 to 26 and a half, something like that, while I was in this relationship, this turbulent relationship. And I ultimately figured out why I was so compulsively drawn, and I allowed myself to end it. And I want to share that piece with you. And it's going to require kind of knowing some of my history, and I might give a little bit of like, just a very brief overview. But I find this utterly fascinating because it was not planned. My relationship with this man, boy, man, I was a girl, not a woman yet, lasted from 24 to 26 and a half, exactly 2.5 years. And it perfectly mirrored the 2.5 years I spent in an experience from 13. I had just turned 13, so it was 13 to 15 and a half, with a 30-year-old man when I was 13, next door neighbor, and a lot of family turmoil around it. And it was a very dark experience. So this neighbor man was an alcoholic, a drug addict, verbally abusive, extremely jealous. Like that was one of the characteristics of the things I went through. Like one of the contexts for all the abuse, I guess you could say, was jealousy. So this 30-year-old man who basically groomed me for 6 months and got me to turn myself against myself and not trust anyone, including my family. I wake up in a nightmare. I felt like I couldn't say no. So I was psychologically manipulated before anything ever happened so that I couldn't decide who to turn to, or, to ask for help, essentially. Then began accusing me of cheating on him with boys my own age. And that was the number one kind of like thing that he would rage about in front of me or at me. And so it definitely was mirrored in this other relationship because jealousy was the primary thing that would cause us to fight. And I firmly believe that we, call it what you will, I'm going to say like we attract relationships or circumstances or experience that will mirror for us anything that we have not completed to be in integrity with ourselves and to move forward in an integrated way. So anything that's an unprocessed trauma, I believe will get mirrored for us in our life in one way or another, most often in intimate relationships, but not always. I mean, it manifests in friendships and in community and in work relationships and circumstances as well. And I believe that's some kind of universal, beautiful nature's checks and balances way of saying, hey, like, wake up, wake up, wake up. Like you can go beyond this. Like you can have a different life than this, but you have to complete this process. Like you have to move forward in an integrated way instead of pretending that it never happened. You need to feel the feelings you never felt before. You need to say the things you never said before. You need to take back ownership of your psyche or your body or your heart, like you didn't before. And with no blame for yourself, right? Like I hope all of us can give ourselves enough grace when we're going through something like this that there isn't self-blame. And I know that sometimes you have to name that and face that as well. I know I did. But I am so incredibly grateful for that relationship. I would not be here today if it weren't for that, I don't think. I'm sure I would have found somebody else to do that with me, do that dance with me. But I've always said of this person who I can actually think back fondly of, there was no outright violence. It was subversive and more emotional, psychological. And the most violent thing that happened in 2.5 years was he grabbed my arm when I was trying to leave. And it felt very threatening to me at the time, and it was like highly charged for me. And I'm not trying to excuse it at all. I'm just saying like it could have been a lot worse. So he was, to me, I've always kind of called it like the nicest, mean person I could have asked for to go through that with me. And we actually had a really sweet moment a year later where I forgave him because it was a lot of, the abuse or toxicity or whatever you would call it was a lot of like his instigating like jealousy accusations, and then doing, enacting behaviors around that were not healthy. And he had tears streaming down his face and said, "I don't know how you could forgive me. I wouldn't. You're amazing." It was a really sweet moment. And I'm just grateful to him for going through that with me. I wanted and always kind of believed that there's the possibility we could go through it together. And, a lot of the time, the other person isn't ready. It's not, but I was ready. And if you are ready, if you are feeling traumatized right now and you're, currently in something like I'm describing, then I would say like, like give yourself permission to use this experience to heal, even if the other person isn't ready to do that as well. So this brings us to, 24 to 26 and a half was a really potent time for me in my healing. And then after I ended things with this person at 26 and a half, I ended up single for at least over 4 years. And I think because of that, didn't really have anything blatantly, in my face, like, here you go, here's the next layer. Because I feel pretty certain most of these patterns we have, because they're created in intimate relationships, most often with family to begin with, and then, first sexual or romantic experiences we have. I think they have to be confronted and healed in intimate relationships. Maybe not always. I'm seeing now the ways in which my trauma patterns have impacted my friendships, and even my career. But that's maybe a story for another time. But I think mostly it shows up in intimate relationships. So I was single for a great period of time. However, I was still feeling pretty unsatisfied, pretty incomplete, really depressed. Like I actually got really depressed. So it was interesting to me in looking at my story is that before this, from 17 to 24, I didn't feel depressed. I just felt nothing. Not nothing, but not a lot of emotion. So I felt very few emotions. I couldn't cry. I hardly felt anything on an emotional level from 17 to 24 because I completely dissociated from all emotion. However, it went into my body, which I think is why I became so obsessed with my body. Little did I know that it was trying to get my attention about all the emotion that was there, right? But then from 26 to really 2011, I went through a pretty dark period of like depression because I wondered, well, is that it? And like, is this, like, was that my healing? Is that, is that it for me? I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I was broke. I couldn't afford to move out of the South. I was still, feeling very volatile with my family members at the time. And it was just a kind of another dark period for me. So huge period of growth, lots of turmoil, lots of drama, lots of feelings, lots of tears, not any depression during that period. No room for it. Afterwards, I kind of sunk into a bit of a, I guess depression, you could call it. And that kind of brings me to maybe a closing point for this part 1, but I'll foreshadow a few things that you're going to hear about in part 2. So the big theme for me in that time period from 26 and a half to 31 was, what the hell am I doing with my life? Like, I'm an adult. I am still not taking care of myself financially. I don't even know what I want to be when I grow up yet. That was the major theme getting my attention. Before that, didn't give a shit. Because this other thing had my attention so fully. It was like, where am I? And I kind of found myself, not fully. But I had kind of like I woke something up, and yet it had nowhere then to like self-express, nowhere, to be, I didn't have a lot of friends. So anyway, this time period from 26 and a half to 30-ish was exploring that for me. What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to find meaning? What is my purpose? Why am I here? Sound familiar? I think we all ask these questions, right? And that question ultimately led me to the things that I would encounter that would help me heal fully. And one of those, I think, as most of you know, if you're watching this video here on the Mobility Mastery YouTube channel or my blog, is I found massage therapy and then fascia release and being stepped on in 2008. So I'm going to talk in part 2 about that moment of being stepped on for the first time, because it woke something up in me even more and opened the door for healing at a much deeper level that would become complete for me and really long lasting and change me in ways I could not have foreshadowed at that time. Like, I had no idea what was about to happen, because at that time in my life, I thought I was an introvert. I needed a lot of alone time. I had all kinds of health issues still that I thought I might deal with for the rest of my life, like digestive issues and anxiety. And turns out all of that wasn't really true, or didn't have to be true. And I changed in ways I couldn't even imagine. But it all started when I was stepped on for the first time at 28. So I'm going to talk about that and then move through how I healed the anxiety and my digestive issues and how that was related to my trauma. And this other piece for me, like the second part, is maybe even the more unconventional route that I went, but similar. So I want to maybe reflect real quick on what I feel is a little different from, what I'm seeing out there getting talked about so much. And I really then want to hear from you. That other than that one instance of therapy and a couple other sessions that I sought out later in my life that I'll maybe talk about in part 2, that's the only trauma therapy I've ever had, and I wouldn't call it trauma therapy. She was not a trauma expert. She knew nothing about somatic psychotherapy. She asked me questions and listened, and that was the extent of it. And it was the typical, well, how did that make you feel? And then how did that make you feel? I got to share. But I want to point this out because I don't believe that our self-healing, our healing of deep traumas, even when it's really, really, really intense, like I feel like my story is pretty intense, I don't buy into the idea that we have to find someone really skilled to help us. I don't buy into the idea that we can't do it alone. I don't know that we should do it alone per se. I think it's better if we can find someone. And I mean, think about just, I don't know, this is maybe what I also want to hear from you on is, if we waited to find the right person to help us, we might wait our whole lives. We might, right? Because, it takes money to try one therapist after another. It takes money to try other modalities other than therapy that might be useful, right? It takes time. It takes commitment. It takes, I don't know. There are so many different personality types out there that the chances of you getting someone who's going to be like the person who can do it all with you is like so slim. And I believe we're in a period right now where self-healing is like the next evolution of humanity. Not to say there isn't a place for community and connection. There absolutely is. And I believe the reason we're all here on the internet and the reason everyone's searching for answers for themselves is because of this. Like, we are here arriving at a time when it is appropriate to help ourselves, to look inside and cultivate the skills, the tools, and the capacities internally to heal, to self-heal. So that was the primary mode through which I have healed, was through self-healing. And I cannot talk about the virtues of writing enough for me, and it may not work for everybody, but if you even kind of like to write or have always kind of thought maybe you should journal, then I highly encourage you to adopt it. And if you do already write and journal, then I encourage you to look into journaling for healing at the trauma level, because I think it can be profoundly helpful and profoundly healing. And yeah, with that, I'm going to close out part 1 of how I healed my trauma. I would love to hear from you and hear if you have any questions for me. And we're going to film part 2 and get that out. So it's coming out right after this one, back to back, one Wednesday, another Wednesday. So we'll get that out to you, but I'm going to start talking more and more about healing trauma and about my perspectives on it, because I feel like there's a missing lane, a missing niche. And I don't think I have the answers for everyone, but perhaps I have the answers for some of you that are maybe a bit more like me, and searching for something different than is currently out there. So leave your comments below, and I will see you in part 2. And thank you so much for watching.